I used to work as a night shift nurse at a small rural hospital in the Midwest. It wasn't a big place, only 3 floors, and the third floor had been shut down for years. Budget cuts, they said. But the stories we heard, those were what kept the staff from ever venturing up there alone. It all started on a quiet Tuesday night. We had fewer patients than usual, and the air felt heavier than normal, like something unseen was pressing down on the building. I was stationed at the nurse's station on the second floor, monitoring the vitals of the patients. The hum of the machines was comforting in its consistency, but that night it was broken by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from directly above me. The third floor. I froze. There shouldn't have been anyone up there. I reached for the phone to call security, but stopped myself. I wasn't about to be that person who panicked over nothing. Instead, I grabbed a flashlight and decided to check it out. Stupid, I know, but curiosity has a way of overpowering common sense. As I ascended the stairs, the air grew colder. By the time I reached the third floor, I could see my breath in front of me. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dimly lit by the emergency lights. Most of the doors to the old rooms were closed, except for one at the far end. It was wide open, and I swear I saw movement inside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I walked toward the open door, every step echoing louder than the last. When I reached it, I hesitated. The room was pitch dark, and my flashlight barely cut through the shadows. But what I saw made my stomach drop. The bed in the center of the room was made up like someone had been living there, and complete with a rumpled blanket and a half-empty glass of water on the nightstand. And then I noticed the wheelchair by the window. Its wheels turned as if someone had recently moved it. Suddenly, a cold breeze blew past me, and I felt something brush against my arm. I spun around, but there was no one there. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, the room seemed full of shadowy figures, all watching me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, and the figures vanished. I ran back to the second floor, my heart pounding. My coworkers gave me strange looks, but I didn't care. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. That wasn't the end of it. Later that night, around 3 a.m., I was checking on one of my patients, a sweet elderly woman named Mrs. Abernathy. She'd been in and out of the hospital for years and loved to tell me stories about her youth. But tonight, she was different, quiet, almost frightened. "Are you okay, Mrs. Abernathy?" I asked, adjusting her blanket. She grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong for someone her age. "Don't let him take me," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Who?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. She didn't answer. Instead, she stared past me, her eyes fixed on the corner of the room. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. At least, not at first. As I squinted into the shadows, I thought I saw a figure, a tall, dark silhouette that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. And then it moved, rushing toward me before vanishing into thin air. Mrs. Abernathy screamed, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I called for help, and another nurse came running. But by the time they arrived, the room was empty, and Mrs. Abernathy had calmed down as if nothing had happened. The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and every time I passed the stairwell leading to the third floor, I felt a cold hand on the back of my neck. A week later, Mrs. Abernathy passed away. I wasn't surprised. She'd been sick for a long time. But what did surprise me was the way she looked when we found her. Her face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, her mouth open in a silent scream, and in her hand she clutched a small, crumpled piece of paper. It took everything in me to unfold it. Written in shaky handwriting were the words, "He's still here." I quit my job a month later. I couldn't handle it anymore. The footsteps, the shadows, the whispers in the empty hallways. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares. And sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear the sound of a wheelchair rolling across the floor. I'll never work the night shift again.
Story number 2.
I used to work as a security guard at a warehouse just outside of town. It was a big, sprawling place with endless rows of shelves stacked with boxes. My job was to patrol the building during the night shift, making sure everything was locked up and no one tried to break in. Easy enough, or so I thought. From the first week, something felt off. The warehouse had this eerie silence that didn't sit right with me. Sometimes, when I walked through the aisles, I could swear I heard footsteps echoing in the distance. But every time I turned to look, there was no one there. One night, around 2 a.m., the motion sensor alarm near the loading dock went off. I checked the monitors in the security office but didn't see anything unusual. Still, I had to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the dock. The air back there was cold, much colder than the rest of the building. My breath fogged up in front of me, which didn't make sense. It was summer. I swung my flashlight around, scanning the area, and that's when I saw it. A single box sitting in the middle of the floor. It wasn't supposed to be there. Curious, I walked over and crouched down to look at it. The box was sealed but covered in dirt, like it had been sitting somewhere forgotten for years. Stamped on the side was the word returned in faded red letters. A loud bang made me jump out of my skin. It came from the other end of the dock, near the heavy steel doors. I whipped my flashlight around, but there was nothing there. My radio crackled to life, and I heard static, followed by a voice. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was faint, like someone whispering from far away. "Help me," it said. My blood ran cold. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. I wanted to leave right then and there, but my job required me to investigate. I approached the steel doors, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. There were handprints on the inside of the door, small child-sized handprints pressed into the dust. I felt sick. There were no children anywhere near this place. The whispering started again, louder this time, and it was coming from behind the steel doors. "Help me, please." I grabbed the handle, hesitating for a moment before pulling it open. The door groaned on its hinges, and beyond it was darkness so complete it felt like it could swallow me whole. And then I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the dark. They were low to the ground, almost at the height of a small child. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I saw shapes. Thin, gaunt figures with skeletal faces and impossibly long arms. The whispering turned into a cacophony of voices, all pleading, crying, screaming, "Help us! Don't leave us! Don't go!" I stumbled backward, slamming the door shut and locking it. The voices stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the banging started, loud and frantic, like someone or something was trying to break through. I ran back to the security office, shaking so badly I could barely hold my flashlight. I sat there staring at the monitors, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. And then the cameras went out. Every single monitor went black, except for one. It showed the loading dock. The box I'd found was gone, replaced by something else. A small wooden doll, crudely made, with buttons for eyes and a twisted, painted-on smile. The cameras came back online, and the doll was gone. I didn't finish my shift that night. I left and never went back. I told my supervisor I was sick, and when they called to ask if I was coming in the next night, I quit. But it didn't end there. A few weeks later, I started hearing noises in my apartment, scratching at the windows, faint whispers in the corners of the room. One night, I woke up to find the same wooden doll sitting on my nightstand, its button eyes staring at me. I burned it, but it didn't matter. The whispers never stopped. Even now, years later, I can still hear them. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I feel like I'm being watched. And every so often, I find handprints on my mirrors. Small, child-sized handprints pressed into the glass. I don't think I'll ever escape them.
Story number 3.
I used to work as an overnight janitor at an old hotel in upstate New York. The place was one of those grand, turn-of-the-century buildings, the kind that used to host presidents and movie stars in its heyday. By the time I started working there, it was a shadow of its former self, half renovated, barely booked, and full of creaky floors and flickering lights. But the pay was decent, and I needed the money. The night everything changed started like any other. I clocked in at 11 p.m., grabbed my cleaning supplies, and began my rounds. The hotel was mostly empty that night, except for a couple of guests on the lower floors. The upper levels, floors 6 through 8, were closed off for renovations. No one was supposed to be up there. Around 2 a.m., I was mopping the lobby when I heard the elevator ding. The sound startled me, mostly because I hadn't seen anyone come down or go up in hours. The front desk was empty, and the only person who might have used it was the night manager, but she'd gone home sick. I glanced toward the elevator, expecting the doors to open. They didn't. The elevator just sat there, its light glowing faintly, like it was waiting for something. Or someone. Probably just a glitch, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. I pushed the mop bucket aside and walked over to the elevator, pressing the button to call it. The doors slid open and I stared at the empty interior. I leaned in and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. But as I stepped back, I noticed something strange. The button for the 8th floor was lit up. That didn't make sense. No one should have been up there. The renovations on that floor were barely started. No carpet, no electricity, and definitely no guests. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped into the elevator, determined to figure out what was going on. The ride up was unnervingly slow, the old machinery groaning and shuddering with every passing floor. When the doors finally opened on the 8th floor, the air that greeted me was heavy and cold. My breath fogged in front of me, and the hallway was dark, illuminated only by my flashlight. The space was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the elevator behind me. I stepped out cautiously, my shoes echoing on the bare concrete floor. The hallway stretched out in both directions, lined with doorways that led to unfinished rooms. As I turned to the left, I heard it, a soft, distant sound like someone humming a lullaby. My heart skipped a beat. I shone my flashlight down the hallway, but there was nothing there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone up here?" The humming stopped. I stood frozen, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get back in the elevator and leave. But something compelled me to move forward, like I was being pulled by an unseen force. As I walked, the temperature seemed to drop even more. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Then, I saw it. A door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from the crack. I approached it slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. When I pushed the door open, the light flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled with my flashlight, desperate to get it working again, and when it finally flickered back to life, I wished it hadn't. In the center of the room was an old wooden chair, and sitting in it was a little girl. Her head was bowed, her long, dark hair hanging like a curtain over her face. She was wearing a tattered dress, the fabric stained and torn, and her hands rested limply on her lap. Are you okay?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't move. I took a step closer, and the floor creaked under my weight. That's when her head snapped up, and I saw her face, or what was left of it. Her skin was pale and mottled, her eyes sunken and black, and her mouth was twisted into an unnatural grin, her teeth jagged and sharp. She let out a piercing scream that echoed through the room, and before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The girl stood up, her movements jerky and unnatural, and began to walk toward me. Her footsteps didn't make a sound. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest until I hit the wall. The flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, plunging the room into darkness once more. I could hear her breathing now, raspy and shallow, and it was getting closer. Somehow I found the strength to move. I scrambled for the flashlight, grabbed it, and shone it in her direction. She was inches from my face, her black eyes staring into mine. She opened her mouth, and I expected her to scream again, but instead, she whispered one word: "Stay." I bolted for the door, throwing all my weight against it until it finally gave way. I ran down the hallway, not daring to look back, and slammed the elevator button repeatedly. The humming had started again, louder this time, and it seemed to be coming from everywhere. The elevator doors opened just as the humming turned into a cacophony of voices, all screaming my name. I jumped inside and hit the button for the lobby, praying the doors would close fast enough. As the elevator descended, the voices faded, replaced by a faint, rhythmic tapping on the ceiling of the car. When I reached the lobby, I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I quit the next day, leaving behind my uniform and a hastily written resignation letter. A few weeks later, I learned the hotel had been abandoned entirely. The renovations stopped, and no one ever explained why. But sometimes late at night, I think about that little girl and the way she whispered, "Stay." And I wonder, if I hadn't run, would I have ever left that floor?
Story number 4.
I used to work the graveyard shift at a 24-hour diner just outside of Albuquerque. The place had been there for decades, a little worn down, but still popular with truckers and night owls. My job was straightforward: clean the tables, take the occasional order, and try not to fall asleep. Most nights were uneventful. A handful of regulars came in to drink coffee and chat, and a few truckers would stop by for a hot meal before hitting the road. But one night, just after 3 a.m., something happened that I still can't explain. It started when a man walked in. He wasn't someone I'd seen before, and something about him immediately put me on edge. He was tall and thin, wearing a dusty black suit that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, there was something wrong with his eyes. They were too dark, like pools of ink, and they seemed to pull you in if you looked at them for too long. He sat at the counter, his movements slow and deliberate, and placed his hands flat on the surface. His fingers were long and bony, the nails cracked and yellowed. I swallowed hard and grabbed my notepad. "What can I get you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Finally, he said, "Coffee." His voice was low and gravelly, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I nodded quickly and poured him a cup. As I placed it in front of him, I noticed something strange. The air around him felt colder, almost like the heat from the kitchen wasn't reaching that part of the diner. "Anything else?" I asked, eager to move away. He shook his head, but his eyes stayed locked on mine. "Long night?" he asked, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah," I replied, stepping back. "You could say that." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that made my skin crawl. I turned away, pretending to wipe down the counter, but I couldn't stop glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. He just sat there, not drinking his coffee, not moving, just staring straight ahead. Then the lights flickered. This wasn't unusual. The wiring in the diner was old, and the lights would occasionally flicker during storms. But that night, the sky was clear, and the flickering felt deliberate, like something was trying to get my attention. I looked back at the man, and he was gone. The cup of coffee sat untouched on the counter, steam still rising from it. My heart started racing as I scanned the diner, but there was no sign of him. The door hadn't opened, and there was no way he could have slipped past me without being noticed. I walked around the counter, calling out, "Hello, sir?" No response. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the far end of the diner. My eyes darted to the corner booth, the one that was always empty. The blinds were half closed, casting long shadows over the table. And there he was. He was sitting in the booth, his hands folded neatly on the table, staring at me with those pitch-black eyes. I hadn't heard him move. I hadn't seen him go there. But there he was, smiling that same unsettling smile. "How?" I started to ask, but the words caught in my throat. "I like this spot," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Cozy." I didn't know what to do. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run out the door and never come back, but I was frozen in place. "Can I get you anything else?" I managed to say, my voice trembling. He shook his head slowly, his smile widening. "No, I'm waiting." "For what?" "You'll see." The lights flickered again, and this time they didn't come back on. The diner was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the neon sign outside. I reached for my phone, desperate for some light, but it wouldn't turn on. That's when I heard the sound. It was a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, my eyes straining to see in the dim light. The kitchen was empty. The tables were empty, but the growling grew louder, closer. "Do you hear it?" the man asked, his voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. I turned back to the booth, but it was empty. The man was gone again. The growling turned into a snarl, and I felt hot breath on the back of my neck. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Nothing I could see, anyway. The air felt thick, oppressive, like something was pressing down on me. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting and shifting in unnatural ways. And then I saw them, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, staring at me from every corner of the diner. I backed away, my legs shaking until I hit the counter. The growling stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. And then the man's voice whispered in my ear, "It's here." I screamed and bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock in my panic. When I finally threw it open and stumbled outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap. I turned back, expecting to see the man or whatever it was, but the diner was empty. The lights were back on, the coffee cup was gone, and everything looked normal. Too normal. I quit that night, leaving my apron on the counter and driving home as fast as I could. I never went back, and I never found out who or what that man was. But sometimes, late at night, when I drive past the diner, I see someone sitting in that corner booth. A man in a dusty black suit staring out the window with a faint, unsettling smile. And I swear, if you stop and look for too long, his eyes will follow you.
Story number 5.
I was a nurse working the night shift at a small-town hospital. It wasn't a busy place. Most nights were quiet, save for the occasional emergency or restless patient. But there was one part of the hospital everyone avoided after dark, the abandoned wing. The wing had been shut down years before, left to decay with its peeling paint and empty rooms. They said it wasn't structurally sound, but everyone knew the real reason. People whispered about strange things happening there, voices when no one was around, shadowy figures in the hallways, and doors that opened or closed on their own. I never believed the stories. I thought they were just rumors to keep new staff on edge. That changed on a night I'll never forget. It started with a patient, an older man named Mr. Turner, admitted for chest pains. He'd been stable all evening, but around 2 a.m., his monitors started acting up, wild fluctuations that didn't make sense. His vitals were fine when I checked him, but the machines kept beeping erratically, as if something was interfering with them. "Something's not right," Mr. Turner whispered as I adjusted his IV. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. He stared at the ceiling, his eyes wide with fear. "She's coming for me." A chill ran down my spine. "Who's coming?" "The woman in white," he said, his voice barely audible. I tried to reassure him, chalking it up to a bad dream or medication side effects, but his fear was palpable. A few minutes later, I was called away to check on another patient. When I returned, Mr. Turner was gone. His bed was empty, the sheets still warm, and the heart monitor flatlined. I hit the call button, summoning security and the on-call doctor. We searched the entire floor, but he wasn't there. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. Then I heard it, a faint humming. It was coming from the hallway that led to the abandoned wing. I froze, my heart pounding. No one was supposed to be in that part of the hospital, especially not a sick, elderly man. But I had to check. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped into the darkened corridor. The air was different here. Heavy, cold, and still. My footsteps echoed loudly, each one making me regret venturing further. The humming grew louder, more melodic, like an old lullaby. "Mr. Turner?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I reached the end of the hallway where a heavy metal door marked the entrance to the abandoned wing. It was supposed to be locked, but tonight it was slightly ajar. Against every instinct, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell of mildew and decay hit me immediately, and my flashlight struggled to pierce the darkness. The humming stopped. "Mr. Turner?" I called again, my voice barely above a whisper. And then I saw her. At the far end of the hallway, bathed in the faint glow of my flashlight, stood a woman. She wore a long white gown, her hair hanging in dark, matted strands over her face. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. She just stood there, motionless. "Ma'am?" I said, my voice cracking. She tilted her head slightly, as if acknowledging me. Then she pointed to one of the rooms. My body screamed at me to run, but something compelled me to move forward. I inched closer, my flashlight flickering as I passed her. She didn't turn to follow me, but I could feel her presence, like cold fingers pressing against my back. The door she'd pointed to was slightly open, the number 3008 barely visible under layers of peeling paint. I pushed it open, my hands trembling. Inside, the room was empty, just a rusted bed frame and a broken chair. But in the center of the floor, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A hospital bracelet. I picked it up, my heart sinking when I read the name. Turner, William. A loud bang behind me made me jump. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The woman was gone. The door slammed shut, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled with my flashlight, desperate to turn it back on, but when the beam finally came to life, I wasn't alone. Mr. Turner was lying on the bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. "Mr. Turner?" I whispered, approaching cautiously. His head snapped toward me, again his mouth opening as if to scream, but no sound came out. His body convulsed, and then he went still. I reached for his wrist, checking for a pulse. There was nothing. He was ice cold. The humming started again, louder this time, filling the room with an otherworldly vibration. I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. "Help me," Mr. Turner's voice croaked behind me. I spun around, but he was gone. The bed was empty again. The humming grew deafening, and the walls seemed to close in around me. Shadows danced across the room, taking on twisted, nightmarish shapes. And then I saw her again, the woman in white, standing in the corner, her head tilted unnaturally to the side. "Leave," she hissed, her voice echoing like it came from the depths of a cave. The door flew open, and I didn't hesitate. I ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the nurse's station. When I told the other staff what had happened, they exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. Later, one of the older nurses pulled me aside. 308, she said quietly. "That room belonged to a patient years ago, a woman who lost her baby here. She didn't take it well. They say she haunts that wing, looking for anyone who might remind her of her child. I transferred to the day shift after that, but sometimes when I pass the abandoned wing, I hear it. The faint sound of humming coming from somewhere deep inside.
Story number 6.
I used to work as a security guard at a large, nearly deserted mall. It wasn't one of those flashy, modern malls. This place was old, built in the early 80s, and most of the stores had long since closed. Only a handful remained: a discount shoe store, a small electronics shop, and a fast food place near the food court. The rest of the mall was a hollow shell, its empty corridors lined with shuttered storefronts and darkened windows. My job was simple: walk the halls, check the locks, and make sure no one was lurking where they shouldn't be. It was usually uneventful, and the quiet nights were almost soothing. But there was one part of the mall that I hated: the old department store. The store had been closed for over a decade, its heavy metal gates permanently locked. Rumor had it the place shut down after a tragic accident. A little girl wandered away from her parents and fell down the escalator shaft. They said she didn't survive. I didn't put much stock in the story. It sounded like the kind of urban legend people made up to make a boring job seem more interesting. But every time I walked past the department store, I felt off. The air was colder there, heavier somehow, and the silence seemed to press against my ears like a physical weight. One night I was doing my rounds when I heard something strange. It was faint at first, a soft, echoing sound that barely registered over the hum of the fluorescent lights. It sounded like laughter. I froze, straining to hear. It came again, louder this time. A high-pitched giggle, unmistakably a child's laughter. My first thought was that a kid had somehow snuck into the mall after hours. It wouldn't have been the first time. I followed the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness as I made my way toward the department store. As I got closer, the laughter stopped. I stood in front of the gated entrance, peering through the metal bars. The store was pitch black, its dusty mannequins barely visible in the faint light from the hallway. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty space. No response. I shone my flashlight into the store, scanning the rows of abandoned displays and empty shelves. That's when I saw it. A shadow darting between the aisles, just out of reach of the beam. "Hey!" I shouted, my heart racing. "This area is off limits." The shadow didn't stop. It moved deeper into the store, disappearing into the darkness. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stay where I was. But I couldn't just leave it. If someone was in there, it was my job to get them out. I unlocked the gate and stepped inside, the metal rattling loudly as I pulled it shut behind me. The air inside was stale, heavy with dust, and something else I couldn't quite place. "Whoever's in here, you need to come out," I said, my voice shaking slightly. The only response was the faint creak of something moving deeper in the store. I followed the sound, my flashlight flickering slightly as I moved between the empty racks. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps. And then I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the store, near the escalators. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, wearing a faded pink dress. Her hair was dark and tangled, and she stood perfectly still, her back to me. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "What are you doing here? Are you lost?" She didn't respond. I took a step closer, and the floor creaked under my weight. Her head tilted slightly like she was listening, but she still didn't turn around. "It's okay," I said, my palms sweating. "I'm here to help you." She turned then slowly, almost mechanically, and I felt my stomach drop. Her face, it wasn't right. Her eyes were too large, too dark, and her skin was pale, almost translucent. But it was her mouth that froze me in place, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched far beyond what should have been possible. She giggled, the sound echoing unnaturally through the empty store, and then she started moving toward me. Her steps were jerky, almost like she was glitching, and every instinct I had screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a wave of cold terror that seemed to seep into my bones. "Play with me," she whispered, her voice soft and lilting like a broken music box. She was only a few feet away now, her grin widening as she reached out a pale, bony hand. That's when the escalators roared to life. The sudden noise snapped me out of my trance, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. The girl's head snapped toward the sound, and for a brief moment, her grin faltered. I didn't wait to see what she would do. I turned and ran, my boots pounding against the tiled floor as I made my way back to the gate. The sound of the escalators grew louder, drowning out everything else, and I could feel her behind me, close enough to touch. I reached the gate and threw it open, slamming it shut behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, securing it, just as the sound of footsteps stopped. I turned, my flashlight sweeping over the entrance. She was gone. The escalators had stopped, the store was silent again, and the oppressive cold had lifted. But I could still feel her eyes on me, watching from the shadows. I quit the job the next day. The mall is still there, still empty, and I've heard it's scheduled for demolition soon. But sometimes late at night, I dream about that little girl in the pink dress and her wide, unnatural grin. And when I wake up, I swear I can hear her giggle, faint and echoing, just outside my window.
Story number 7.
I worked the night shift as a paramedic in a small, rural town. Most calls were mundane: car accidents, heart attacks, overdoses. But every so often we'd get a call that stuck with us. One night, we received one of those calls, and it still gives me chills when I think about it. It was a little after midnight when the call came in, a single vehicle accident on an isolated stretch of road outside of town. The caller said they saw a car veer off the road and into the woods. No further details. My partner, Jake, and I headed out, the flashing lights cutting through the darkness as we drove down the narrow, tree-lined road. It was unusually quiet that night, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. When we arrived at the scene, there was no sign of a crash. No skid marks, no broken glass, nothing to indicate a car had left the road. We almost radioed it in as a false report, but then Jake spotted it, a faint glint of metal in the woods. We parked and grabbed our gear, making our way through the thick underbrush. About 50 yards in, we found the car. It was an old sedan, its front end crumpled against a tree. The windshield was shattered, and the driver's door hung open. "Hello?" I called out, shining my flashlight into the surrounding trees. No response. Jake leaned in to check the car. "Looks like the airbag's deployed. Blood on the driver's seat, but no one's here." I felt a prickle of unease. Maybe they wandered off looking for help? Or they're injured and unconscious somewhere, Jake said grimly. We split up, searching the immediate area. The woods were eerily silent, the only sound our footsteps crunching on dead leaves. After a few minutes, I found something. A shoe, a small white sneaker, smeared with blood. "Jake, over here!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. He came running, his flashlight swinging wildly. "What is it?" I held up the shoe. "Looks like it belongs to a kid." Jake frowned. "There wasn't a child seat in the car. Are we sure this is from the crash? Who else would it belong to?" Before he could respond, we heard it. A faint, high-pitched cry like a child sobbing. We froze, exchanging uneasy glances. The sound was coming from deeper in the woods, faint but unmistakable. "Let's go," Jake said, already moving toward the noise. We followed the sound, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The crying grew louder, more desperate. But the further we walked, the more disoriented I felt. It was as if the forest was closing in around us, the trees pressing tighter together. Finally, we came to a small clearing. In the center stood a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, wearing a white nightgown that was torn and dirty. Her long, dark hair obscured her face as she sobbed, her small shoulders shaking. "Hey, sweetheart," I said gently, stepping forward. "Are you hurt? We're here to help." She didn't respond, didn't even look up. Jake moved to my side, his flashlight trained on her. "Where are your parents, honey? Were you in the car?" Still nothing. I reached out a hand, my heart aching for her. "It's okay. We're going to..." Before I could finish, she raised her head. Her face wasn't right. Her eyes were pitch black, bottomless voids that seemed to swallow the light. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, her teeth sharp and jagged like shards of broken glass. I stumbled back, my blood turning to ice. "What the hell?" She let out a piercing scream, a sound that felt like it was ripping through my skull. The air grew cold, and the trees around us seemed to shudder. Jake grabbed my arm. "Run!" We bolted, crashing through the underbrush as the scream followed us, echoing through the trees. I didn't dare look back, too terrified of what I might see. When we finally broke through the tree line and reached the road, the sound stopped. The air was still again, heavy with an unnatural silence. We leaned against the ambulance, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" Jake whispered, his face pale. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking, but it wasn't human. We radioed for backup, claiming the driver was missing and the woods were too dangerous to search alone. When the sheriff and his deputies arrived, we told them what we saw, leaving out the part about the girl's face. They combed the woods for hours, but found nothing. No girl, no footprints, no sign of anyone other than us. The only thing they recovered was the bloody shoe I'd found earlier. The official report listed the incident as a hit and run, with the driver fleeing the scene. But Jake and I knew better. A few weeks later, I heard a story from one of the older EMTs. He said that stretch of road had a history. Decades ago, a car had crashed into the woods, killing a woman and her daughter. The mother's body was found, but the little girl was never recovered. They say she still wanders the woods, looking for someone to play with. I transferred to another station after that. I couldn't drive past those woods without feeling like something was watching me. And sometimes late at night, I hear her scream in my dreams.
Story number 8.
I was fresh out of nursing school when I landed a night shift job at an old, understaffed psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of a small town. The place had been around for over a century, its weathered brick walls and creaking floorboards a testament to its age. It was a maze of dimly lit hallways and locked doors, and the stories the staff told on breaks didn't help ease my nerves. They said the hospital was haunted, but I didn't believe in ghosts. I figured the patients' stories of shadowy figures and strange whispers were just delusions. But after my first week, I began to question everything I thought I knew. It started with small things. Lights flickering in rooms where no one was, footsteps echoing down empty hallways, and the faint sound of someone humming a lullaby when the halls were supposed to be silent. The other nurses laughed it off, saying it was just the old building settling, but I wasn't so sure. One night, I was assigned to the geriatric wing, which had a reputation for being the most haunted part of the hospital. The patients there were mostly elderly and nonverbal, spending their days in wheelchairs, staring blankly at the walls. My shift began like any other, checking vitals, administering medication, and updating charts. Around 2 a.m., I was doing my rounds when I heard it. Soft crying coming from room 7. Room 7 was supposed to be empty. I stopped outside the door, my heart pounding. The sound was unmistakable, a woman sobbing, her cries muffled like she was trying to keep quiet. Swallowing my fear, I opened the door and stepped inside. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the hallway light. The bed was neatly made, untouched since the last patient had been discharged. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The crying stopped. I stood frozen, my flashlight sweeping across the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt heavy, suffocating. I turned to leave, but as I reached for the door, I heard it again, this time right behind me. A deep, shuddering sob. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The room was empty. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The sobbing turned into laughter, low and raspy, like it was coming from someone who hadn't used their voice in years. I bolted, slamming the door shut behind me. Back at the nurse's station, I tried to calm myself down. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by fatigue. But deep down, I knew better. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, I was working in the isolation ward, where the most dangerous patients were kept. Most of them were heavily sedated, locked in their rooms for everyone's safety. Around 3 a.m., I was doing my rounds when I noticed one of the doors slightly ajar. It was room 22, home to a patient named Mr. Grayson. He was in his 60s, a frail man with wild white hair and eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. He was a quiet patient, never causing trouble, but he had a habit of talking to someone who wasn't there. I peeked inside, expecting to see him asleep, but the bed was empty. "Mr. Grayson?" I called out, stepping into the room. The air was cold, much colder than the rest of the ward, and the faint smell of rot lingered in the air. "Mr. Grayson, you're not supposed to leave your room," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I heard it then, a faint whisper coming from the corner of the room. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, and my blood ran cold. Mr. Grayson was crouched in the corner, his back to me. His body was trembling, his bony fingers clawing at the floor. "Mr. Grayson, are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. He stopped moving. Slowly, he turned his head to look at me, and I felt my stomach drop. His eyes were wide, almost black, and his mouth was stretched into a twisted smile. "They're here," he whispered. "They've always been here." Before I could respond, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, but it wouldn't turn on. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, my flashlight landing on a figure standing in the corner. It was tall and thin, its body shrouded in darkness, but its eyes, Its eyes glowed red, piercing through the blackness. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its footsteps echoing in the small room. I backed away, my heart pounding, but there was nowhere to go. "Leave," Mr. Grayson said, his voice distorted and unnatural. "You don't belong here." The figure lunged, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in the hallway, my coworkers standing over me. They said they'd found me unconscious outside room 22, but when they checked the room, it was empty. Mr. Grayson was never found. His disappearance was written off as an escape, though no one could explain how he got past the locked doors and security cameras. I quit the job a week later. The hospital is still there, still operating, but I'll never set foot inside again. Sometimes late at night, I hear that laughter in my dreams, and when I wake up, I swear I can feel cold breath on the back of my neck.
Story number 9.
It was the kind of job you take when you're desperate. Graveyard shift at an old gas station in the middle of nowhere. The kind of nowhere where cell service drops off, and the only company you have are the moths circling the flickering neon sign outside. I was 22, broke, and trying to save for college. The manager, a wiry old man named Gus, warned me during my first shift, "You'll see some strange folks out here at night. Just stay behind the counter, keep the doors locked, and don't ask questions." I laughed it off at the time, thinking he meant drunks or the occasional weirdo passing through. But by the end of my first week, I knew better. The first strange thing happened around 2 a.m. I was restocking the chips aisle when I heard the chime of the front door. I looked up, but no one was there. "Hello?" I called out, peering over the counter. No response. The parking lot was empty, the only car in sight being my beat-up sedan parked out front. I shrugged it off as a glitch in the system and went back to stocking shelves. But then it happened again. Chime. This time I walked around the counter to check. The door was shut, the lock in place. I stepped outside, the cool night air prickling my skin. The road stretched out into the darkness, empty and silent. When I turned to go back inside, I noticed something odd. Footprints. Bare footprints, pressed into the thin layer of dust that had settled on the concrete. They led from the door to the edge of the lot, where they abruptly stopped. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep well that day. The next night, it got worse. Around 3 a.m., a man walked in. He was tall and thin, dressed in an old-fashioned suit that looked like it had been pulled from a 1920s catalog. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, there was something off about them. Too dark, too empty. He didn't say a word as he walked up to the counter, just placed a $5 bill on the counter and pointed to the pack of cigarettes behind me. I grabbed the pack, sliding it across the counter to him. "Long night?" I asked, trying to fill the silence. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked out without taking his change. When I looked down at the register, the $5 bill wasn't there anymore. In its place was a torn, faded photograph. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl, standing in front of an old gas station. My gas station. The man in the photograph was wearing the same suit as the customer. I stared at the picture, my heart racing. When I looked back up, the parking lot was empty. The following night, I almost called in sick, but I needed the money. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and overthinking things. The shift started off quiet. No customers, no strange occurrences. Around 4 a.m., I was restocking the cooler when the lights flickered. "Not again," I muttered, stepping out into the main store. The lights flickered again, then went out entirely, plunging the station into darkness. The hum of the coolers stopped, leaving an oppressive silence. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark. That's when I saw her, a little girl standing in the middle of the store. She was wearing a white dress, torn and dirty, and her long, dark hair hung in front of her face. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I took a step closer, and she lifted her head. Her eyes were hollow, black voids, and her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. The flashlight flickered, and when it came back on, she was gone. I ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, though I hadn't touched it. The lights came back on, and the store was empty again. My heart was pounding as I unlocked the door and stepped outside, desperate for fresh air. That's when I heard it, a faint humming, coming from the side of the building. I followed the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I rounded the corner, the beam landed on a figure crouched near the dumpster. It was the man in the suit. He was hunched over, his back to me, his hands clawing at the dirt. "Hey!" I shouted, though I immediately regretted it. He froze, slowly turning his head to look at me. His face was twisted, his mouth stretched wide in the same unnatural grin as the little girl's. "Leave," he rasped, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. "This place isn't for you." I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. When I looked up again, he was gone. I didn't finish the shift. I locked up and drove home, leaving a message for Gus that I wasn't coming back. A few weeks later, I was scrolling through the local news when I saw a story about the gas station. It had burned down overnight, the cause unknown. The article mentioned that the station had been built on the site of an old family home that had burned down in the 1920s, killing everyone inside. The photograph flashed in my mind: the man, the woman, and the little girl. I don't know what I saw during those shifts, but I haven't worked a night job since. And sometimes, when I drive past the empty lot where the station used to stand, I swear I see someone standing there, watching.
Story number 10.
I never thought I'd be the one sharing a story like this. I've always loved reading or listening to scary night shift tales, convincing myself that they were just exaggerated accounts. But now, after what happened to me, I can't shake the feeling that some places carry something truly sinister. I used to work the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store in rural Indiana. The pay wasn't great, but the hours suited me, and the town was small and quiet enough that I didn't mind being alone in the store. My shifts were usually uneventful, restocking shelves, dealing with the occasional late-night customer, and trying to stay awake until morning. But one night, about 6 months ago, everything changed. It started like any other shift. I clocked in at 10 p.m., exchanged pleasantries with the evening cashier, and started my routine. Around midnight, the store was empty except for me. I was behind the counter, scrolling through my phone, when the automatic door slid open with its usual ding. I looked up, expecting to see a customer, but no one was there. At first, I thought it might be the wind triggering the sensor. That kind of thing had happened before. I shrugged it off and went back to my phone. But then the door slid open again. "Hello?" I called out, stepping out from behind the counter. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the shelves cast long, eerie shadows. Still, there was no one there. I walked to the door and glanced outside. The parking lot was empty, and the only sound was the faint hum of the streetlights. Feeling a little uneasy, I locked the door temporarily. Customers would just have to knock if they wanted to get in. I returned to the counter, trying to shake off the creeping sense of unease. About an hour later, as I was restocking some shelves near the back of the store, I heard a soft tapping sound. It was faint, like fingernails gently rapping on glass. My heart jumped, and I froze, listening. The sound continued, steady and deliberate. I walked toward the front of the store, my footsteps echoing in the empty aisles. The tapping was coming from the front door. As I approached, I saw a figure standing outside, a man, tall and thin, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and an old-fashioned coat. His face was obscured in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me. "Sorry, we're closed for a bit," I called out, trying to sound casual. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, his hands still tapping against the glass. Something about him felt wrong. His stillness, his silence, it was unnerving. I stayed behind the counter, watching him carefully. After a few moments, he stopped tapping and slowly walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the parking lot. I exhaled a shaky breath, telling myself he was just some strange drifter. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. The rest of the night was quiet, but the unease never left me. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting the man to return. At around 4 a.m., I decided to take a short break in the back room. I grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down, trying to distract myself with a crossword puzzle. That's when I heard it again, the tapping. But this time, it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the window in the back room. The back of the store faced an overgrown field, and there was no reason anyone would be back there. My stomach dropped as I slowly turned to look at the window. The man was there, standing just outside, his face still hidden in shadow. He wasn't tapping this time. Instead, he pressed his hand flat against the glass, his long, pale fingers splayed out. I scrambled to my feet, knocking over my coffee in the process. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me through the glass. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but as soon as I hit call, the screen went black. Dead battery. Of course. When I looked back at the window, the man was gone. I didn't hear footsteps or see any sign of him outside. He had just vanished. I didn't go back into the store. Instead, I sat in the back room, clutching my phone and praying for the shift to end. When the morning cashier finally arrived at 6 a.m., I bolted out of there without even clocking out. I didn't say anything to my coworker, too afraid of sounding crazy. I called in sick for the next few nights, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was just overtired and imagining things. But when I finally returned to work, the unease came flooding back. The first few hours of my shift were fine, but around midnight I noticed something strange. One of the security cameras was glitching, the screen flickering with static. It was the camera that faced the back of the store. I switched to the live feed from another camera and froze. The man was back. He was standing in the same spot outside the back window, his face still obscured. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen. He wasn't moving, just standing there like before. I wanted to run, to get out of there, but I felt rooted to the spot. And then slowly he turned his head and looked directly into the camera. The screen went black. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my car in the parking lot, the sun just beginning to rise. My manager found me there and said I looked pale as a ghost. I quit that day and never went back. I don't know who or what that man was, but I've heard stories from others who've worked the night shift in small, rural towns. They talk about seeing shadowy figures, hearing strange sounds, feeling like they're being watched. All I know is that I'll never work another night shift again.